From the high desert of Boulder, Colorado, a beautiful mutant nexus just beneath the Flatiron Mountains, about a mile above the sea level portion of the Babylon Matrix. This is Jonathan Zapp of ZappOracle.com, and this is it's called The Mutant versus Mass Psychosis. So maybe I should explain what a mutant is, and there is a glossary of terms, of my terms, on the homepage of the website. And here's how it defines a mutant, so we know what we're talking about. A mutant is not a genetic anomaly, but a person who is undergoing evolutionary metamorphosis. Mutants are empowered by a core of self-actualization, what Jung called individuation. A mutant is a self-aware, interdimensional traveler. Now, we're all interdimensional travelers. We travel to the dream time every night, for example, who is taking charge of his or her own interdimensional journey into the unknown. A mutant is someone who has a deep commitment to consciousness, which means a willingness to peel back the many layers of acquired conditioning and to help along the project of consciousness in general. This means that the deep commitment extends to others who are also committed to consciousness. A mutant with a capital M is one who serves transpersonal aims and is not merely looking to enhance his own status. It is this sort of mutant that Jung is referring to when he says, every advance in culture is, psychologically, an extension of consciousness, a coming to consciousness that can take place only through discrimination. Therefore, an advance always begins with individuation, that is to say, with the individual, conscious of his isolation, cutting a new path through hitherto untrodden territory. To do this, he must first return to the fundamental facts of his own being, irrespective of all authority and tradition, and allow himself to become conscious of his distinctiveness. If he succeeds in giving collective validity to his widened consciousness, he creates a tension of opposites that provides the stimulation which culture needs for its further progress. Mutants are the intended users of ZappOracle.com. So I'm recording this on October 30th, the day before Halloween, 6 days before the election of 2024, where there's a lot of nervous tension in the air because the election is a statistical dead heat. No one knows where it's going, and there is a lot at stake. And part of what's at stake is whether the country will surrender to mass psychosis or not. So, one thing I wanted to talk about is chemical versus alchemical change. So when we're dealing with something that's happening in the outer world, political events, there is the chemical way of creating change, and that would be in the way of activism. And I've certainly done that. I've worked for environmental causes and a nonprofit that was helping fund women in Muslim countries who were fighting back against oppression, or just taking care of other women who had been burned in stove burnings. I'm talking about a Progressive Women's Alliance, I think it's called, in Islamabad, Pakistan, and so forth. So this is working, and very important work, just like my 14 years as a school teacher. This is mostly working in the chemical or causal plane of like doing real things with actual people to create physical change and so forth. Other types of work, like what I'm doing right now, are closer to the alchemical. I mean, these two overlap. But when we're trying to change consciousness, then that's more on the alchemical plane. Some of it is acausal. It can work through mysterious butterfly effects. Of course, butterfly effects would still be causal, but in some cases, it's working through more mysterious means where if it is causal, the chain of cause and effect is much more subtle and sometimes hidden. So because everything that is happening to us, except for geological events like an erupting volcano or an asteroid hit and things like that, even our weather now, it can be seen as to some extent a psychological artifact in that we have man-made climate change, and that's happening because of what? The human psyche. So everything going on with the economy, money is a 100% psychological artifact. It only works because enough people believe it has value and so forth. So when we are working more directly with changing the psyche, and that can be just changing yourself, like it says in the I Ching, the right person thinking the right thoughts alone in their room changes things thousands of miles away. And this is because of the collective unconscious. The changes that happen to your psyche affect the larger psyche, the field of consciousness that is carried by the whole species. So, for example, so this idea of creating subtle butterfly effects is central in my sci-fi epic. It took me 45 years to write. You can read this free on the website, but if you want to support the website and what I'm doing, you can get it on Amazon as an Audible. I think that's the best version, a Kindle, and also as a physical book, as you see here. There's an online text version, well displayed, on the website. And if anybody can send me an email if they can't afford the audio version, I'll see about getting you a free version of it. So anyway, but in that book, there is much about, it's about mutants versus mass forces. This is a theme, this is a motif or aspect of the singularity archetype I call the mutant versus the machine. And a mass psychosis is like a machine in that it is governed by mechanical man. We can call anything mechanical that's not governed by individual free will and consciousness. So here's a quote from Parallel Journeys. A character who's being called to make a kind of intervention through butterfly effects to prevent an extinction says, I'd like to refuse. I'd love to refuse, but you said there's an extinction coming. If there's something I can do to prevent it, I should. Still, I'm one person. I don't understand. How could I possibly create that much change? And the character he's talking to says, don't underestimate the difference one person can make. The more anomalous you are, the more change you create, for better or worse. The mission seems overwhelming because you're thinking of it in causal terms. I must do A to cause B. But sometimes we create change by simply being, rather than by a specific action. You're right, though. There is much ambiguity in all of this. I have no way of knowing how or even if this intervention will succeed. We can only work with what is presently in front of us and hope for the best. This is the opposite of a causal mission where we have an exact physical objective. We have a general goal, but we cannot structure in advance the means we need to get there. I may have an influence on you that creates a butterfly effect, and you may, in turn, generate your own effects, the ends of which are unknowable. Through your own subtle means, you may alter the human timeline just enough to bypass extinction. So alchemists had a idea that they should live their entire lives as if the fate of the whole cosmos depended on even their smallest actions. And in a way it does, because if I decide I'm going to, put my hand up like that, and then now there's a different cosmos in which the video recorded with that hand up. So every action, and so therefore I've made a permanent mark on the history of the cosmos with that one gesture. So, but obviously some effects, some things we do may may not have a imprint that ripples out all that powerfully, but we never know. When people have near-death experiences, one of the most common things is they'll come back and say, things that I thought were major, like getting a job promotion, turn out to be minor. And things I thought were minor, like a friendly interaction with a store clerk, turn out to be a major event that had all kinds of significant butterfly effects coming off of it. So part of the answer, because this is the idea of this video, is like, what do we as individuals do, given that there are historical forces and collective forces at work that are outside the control of any person, no matter how powerful, even if they were a president. It's not within, or even any group of people, because that's the flaw in a lot of grand conspiracy theories, is there's no group of human egos that could act as puppet masters to control everything. We see a phenomenal world with competing spheres of power and wild card events that were unintended, black swan events and so forth. And these cannot be controlled by even a group of powerful people. So the answer is mostly just to, in addition to doing things like voting and to doing some outer actions, a lot of it is about just living your life in an impeccable way, and being the best influence you can on other people and on events that you participate in. Also, something to keep in mind as we're feeling a lot of anxiety about how this election may unfold, we don't even really know what's good news and what's bad news. It's like that old story, you've probably heard it before, so it's might be a little bit tedious, but there's this Chinese farmer, and his son is out working in the fields and breaks his leg, and a neighbor comes by and says, "Oh, that's terrible news, that your son broke his leg, that's going to interfere with farming and all that kind of stuff." And the Chinese farmer, who's the father of the son, says, "Well, let's see." But then it turns out that the army comes through the town looking to conscript young men into the army, and they don't take his son because his leg is broken. And when he shares that to the neighbor says, "Oh, well, that's good news." But the farmer says, "Well, let's see." And then it just keeps going on like that, because each event is connected to a multiplicity of future events where from our position in time, we can't see how it all plays out. And many things happen very paradoxically. Often it will turn out that something that is done that seems oppressive and may be oppressive actually paradoxically creates an evolutionary effect. For example, I've used this example before, but there's one man alive today, not alive today, but there's one person in human history who probably spurred the evolution of the marijuana plant, for better or worse, as a potent psychoactive medicine more than any other. And the answer to that would be probably Ronald Reagan, because he revved up the war on drugs, more closely monitored guarded the border with Mexico so that we had less cheap swag brickweed coming in, set up these zero tolerance laws, but where penalties were based on the weight of the product or the number of plants being grown. And this basically created the funding for the home growing industry, and where you had the same risk for the same weight or number of plants. So you could increase your profit margin while having the same risk by growing super dank weed. And you had the money to do it because you were able to command higher prices because it was illegal, so therefore it was all black market goods and so on. So this is the strange thing about evolution, things that we think are like, why should there be mosquitoes? They've killed more people than all wars. But there are these British biologists who came up with something they call the Red Queen hypothesis. It comes from Alice in Wonderland. Basically, in Alice in Wonderland, the Red Queen explains to Alice, you see, here, my dear, you must run as fast as you can just to stay in one place. And this is these British biologists thought this was analogous to the position of host organisms in relation to parasites. That parasites, according to National Geographic, outnumber all other types of animals 4 or 5 to 1. And the only way to stay ahead of them, they believe, was for hosts to evolve sexual reproduction, because that had much more genetic novelty than the more primitive asexual reproduction. So basically, something as fundamental to our evolution as sexual reproduction may have been in response to parasitism. So this is part of the paradoxical aspects that should cause us to give us some chance of like trying to detach from the way events unfold. And we know that history will take many dark turns. So, it may not help us if we're on the ground and getting bombed because of a war or something like that. But it's good to have an underlying philosophy of some sort that isn't at war with the phenomenal world. So the position of Taoism is that the universe is unfolding as it should, even if that's fantastically different than the way that our supervisory ego would like to see things unfold. And so, and this is also related to what I call the singularity archetype. And this is the book that would have infinite connection to this theme of the mutant versus the machine. I'll be reading an excerpt from it later about that specific motif. This book can be purchased on Amazon as a physical book or a Kindle, or you can read the second edition free on the websites. So, with the singularity archetype, which relates to the parallel event horizons of personal death and species metamorphosis, evolutionary metamorphosis. And these parallel, because the small part recapitulates the whole, like in a fractal or a hologram. And therefore, when the ego views the singularity, and whether it is either death or that future of the species, there's a kind of split view, because there's the ego view of it, and then there is the view of what Jung called the self. And the self is the totality of all the psychic structures, including the ego, the soul, the spirit, everything. And this self is much more transtemporal, while the ego is bound more in space and time and linear time and so on. So when the ego views death, it views it as emergency. When the self views death, it may see it more as emergence. Similarly, when the ego looks out at the event horizon of species metamorphosis, it is more likely to see it through the lens of the dark side of the singularity archetype. Every archetype has a light and dark side, and that would be apocalypticism. It would to see it apocalyptically, whereas when it is perceived by the self, it's seen as a quantum evolutionary event. But, and this is a very important but, the ego is not wrong from its point of view. Death often does present as an emergency while you're in the body. And the metamorphosis of the species could involve extinction level events. So we have to kind of keep this paradoxical nature of reality, that light and dark are not so simple as like a Manichaean view would have. You believe that it's like we need good to triumph over evil once and for all. That's really not the way it works. You can read something I wrote called Tolkien and the Developmental Need for Evil. I think it's also YouTube. You need to have darkness to get things going. If it wasn't for, in the Tolkien mythology, for ring wraiths, orcs, Saurons, Saruman, and so forth. We just have hobbits going out on dates with other hobbits and having second and third breakfasts and this kind of thing. There wouldn't be much evolution, whereas what actually takes place in the story, because of all that dark pressure, is a vast turning of the ages. So both Terence McKenna and I, completely independent of each other, I call him my late colleague because we did get to talk a few times. I was mostly like giving him shit about the sloppy thinking involved in his time wave 2000 theory and that kind of thing. Would have liked to talk to him more about other things, but there were so many parallels in our evolutionary insights, and Terence at one point came up with a kind of think out of the box idea that if Gaia were conscious, as British biologist James Lovelock postulates in his Gaia hypothesis that actually won a Nobel Prize, the thing she would be most concerned about would not be our little bit of environmental pollution, but about the every so 60 million years asteroidal impacts that could sterilize the whole planet. So like the last one was 66 million years ago, that basically, as Terence put it, flattened anything larger than a chicken. It took 100,000 years just for forests to come back after that. And but that was also, in that paradoxical way, the opportunity for mammalian evolution. Otherwise, it'd all be like T-Rex and brontosauruses and so forth. Very likely if that hadn't happened. But so he hypothesized, just like as a kind of more of a thought experiment, that if Gaia were conscious, she would create a technology extruding primate, us in other words, who would eventually create deep space radar and nuclear tip projectiles, basically to act as her immune system to stop these asteroidal impacts. My version of it was even more strange, that it was, I said it was quite possible that, due to the paradoxical way things that could unfold, is that a needed evolutionary development would be a massive thermonuclear war, which I hope is not what's needed, but but perhaps by having, in an unprecedented way, so many, because according to Annie Jacobsen in her brilliant but frightening, terrifying book that just came out on nuclear war, you could have 2 billion deaths in the first couple of days. And maybe only by having that many psyches leaving the body all at once, with so much interrupted will to live, these are not people dying of old age, right? Necessarily, that would create the next form of consciousness or the next species or something like that. So we just don't know, as the Zen master Suzuki Roshi said, to worry is preposterous. Like, we don't know enough about the strange paradoxical way that things unfold to know for sure that the things that we dread and need to, like, I'm not voting from a transtemporal evolutionary point of view, but from like a sensible ego-based one, where like I don't want the guy who says he will use the military against the enemy within his political opponents, and so but in some possible timeline, maybe having him come in and create some disasters would help people break out of some of the mass psychosis on the right. And maybe if it's Harris and there's an economic crash during her presidency, that will bring in a far worse candidate in the 2028 election and so on. We just don't know. But when we're making decisions with our egos or voting, we need to choose the much less evil of the two candidates. Okay, they don't have to be perfect, but at least don't choose one that's like so obviously a totalitarian. So so now we have so for example, in one of the great Dune novels by Frank Herbert. It might have been number 4. God, Emperor of Dune. Might be a slight plot spoiler, but I think this becomes pretty evident early on. We have a grandson or son of Paul Atreides who's merged with a sandworm and become like an almost immortal being, or at least he can live for millennia. And early on in his evolution, he has perceived what he calls a golden path. And that path is to be a tyrant, not out of a personal will to power or for egoistic reasons, but it's a paradoxical evolutionary path, that by being a tyrant and kind of suppressing the human species for millennia, that then the forces of consciousness and evolution in the human species, when they are strong enough to overthrow him, will never again be set back, and this kind of thing. So that's an example of someone who has a transtemporal awareness that can actually transcend what we can perceive on our plane of space-time and ordinary cause and effect, to see how evolution could work through such paradoxical means. But basically, the situation we're in is really about consciousness and eros, a life drive, as Jung uses the term, versus thanatos, a death drive. So it relates to my one-sentence version of the Jewish religion, or maybe it's just my one-sentence religion, which is to carry the torch of consciousness forward and engage rigorous self-examination to advance ethical conduct. So that project is not really threatened. I mean, obviously, if I'm killed or being tortured or something, it would be by whoever is elected president next. I'm still going to be trying to do that. And so one way of dealing as an individual with the insanity of history, that's kind of like a giant cyclops careening down the street, and just going like a drunken monster, and quite often the long skull shadows of history, the nightmare from which I am trying to awaken, as James Joyce put it, is just to do the best you can between awakening and bedtime. And I got that idea from Dale Carnegie. I always thought he was some kind of awful stereotyped, like power of positive thinking type person. Norman Vincent Peale was that. That was the minister that Donald Trump and his family kept going to see on Sundays, and where Trump got some of his ideas about, being kind of like willing things into being. So, and he is a kind of untrained chaos magician, creates his own reality distortion field, as Steve Jobs does. Because again, magical technologies, like all technologies, can be used for good or ill. But in any case, what Dale Carnegie said was, he used the analogy of ocean-going travel in boats, which we kind of romanticize, but was really kind of hellish before the modern era, especially. I remember one British guy, maybe early in the 19th century, said that it was just like being in prison, with the strong possibility of drowning thrown into the bargain. But when ocean-going travel got a lot safer was when they designed boats. Modern ocean liners, for example, would have this with airtight bulkheads. This meant that you'd have all these, 16 or so airtight bulkheads. So if an iceberg hits the hull of the ship, then maybe it tears open one or two of those, but the ship doesn't just fill with water and go down because of one hole in the hull. In the hull, it's been compartmentalized in that way. What happened with Titanic? Titanic did have those watertight bulkheads, but the iceberg ripped through a critical number of those so that it was going to lose buoyancy in a couple of hours. But what Dale Carnegie said was live in day-tight compartments. Like if you're going to live where you're worried about every day in the future, then that's just too much stress. Like worry about what you can do from awakening to bedtime today. And so it's just like somebody said in 2008 when we were worried that we might have a complete financial collapse. And he said, well, you know, the morning after the complete financial collapse, somebody's going to be hungry and somebody else is going to make a few dollars by serving them breakfast. Basically, you know, things will still continue. And so this is kind of what we need to do is we need to focus on our part of the puzzle and of doing the best job we can and being aware of, I don't like it when people tell me, oh, the news is so negative, I just tune it out. And that's kind of a bit of a selfish luxury because we need to have informed citizens or the wrong person ends up in office. We need people to be aware of what's going on in the world, be concerned about it, do things about it, communicate to other people about it, and so on. I mean, I have a lot of Gen Z friends, and with some, you can talk to them about what's going on with the election, and they're so detached from it. It can feel like I'm talking to them about how to make the finer points of how to make fly fishing lures. I'm not a fisherman, but, you know, or something like that. To them, it can seem like there's some kind of like old person hobby talk. Like, what's this got to do with me? Well, as I point out to them, you're 18, 19, 20 years old. They're not drafting 66-year-olds into the army if things get bad, but you're more vulnerable to the fluctuations of history than I am because you're a young guy in good health with prime drafting age. Think about that. This does relate to your life. Anyway, so we need to be concerned about it, but we need to keep our focus on what we can do and not get too distracted from that. But let me go into some quotes from Carl Jung, and that also relate to this idea of what is the idea of what can the individual do? Because, and I relate well to Jung and his perspective in these quotes and elsewhere. We're also typologically, according to Jung's typology, the same type, which would be an introverted, intuitive thinking type. So if you're an introverted thinking type, as Marie-Louise von Franz, his most brilliant colleague, pointed out, then you're more interested in like the alchemical level, the psyche, and so forth. If you're a extroverted thinking type, then that makes you more likely to be a social engineer and to like be an activist and a politician and to like change things by changing regulations and laws and social structures. I'm not confident in social engineering at all. Maybe there's somebody who's wise enough to do that, but I don't get involved in social engineering. I'm much more interested in the psyche and the consciousness of the individual and of looking at the deepest patterns, which for me is the singularity archetype. Okay, here's Jung speaking. All the quotes will be from Volume 10 of the collected works, Civilization and Transition, a book I first read when I was 20 and a senior in college in 1978, and I've reread it 3 times now. I read it again in 2011 before I wrote this book, and then last summer of 2024, because I knew that, okay, things are going in the wrong direction this election. You know, I'm going to have to talk about mass psychosis. So anyway, so this is all from that book called Civilization and Transition. The integration of unconscious contents is an individual act of realization, of understanding, and moral evaluation, it is a most difficult task, demanding a high degree of ethical responsibility. Only relatively few individuals can be expected to be capable of such an achievement, and they are not the political, but the moral leaders of mankind. The maintenance and further development of civilization depends on such individuals, for it is obvious enough that the consciousness of the masses has not advanced since the First World War, and he was probably writing this before the Second World War, and I would add it has not perceivably advanced since the Second World War either, at least in many cases. With some individuals it has. Only certain reflective minds have been enriched, and their moral and intellectual horizon has been considerably enlarged by the realization of the immense and overwhelming power of evil, and of the fact that mankind is capable of becoming merely its instrument. But the average man is still where he was at the end of the First World War, or we could say where he was in the Renaissance or earlier times. It's the evolution of technology is obvious, the evolution of the human psyche somewhat less obvious, though the spiral dynamics evolutionary model makes a good case that if we take the group consciousness as a whole, we do see epochs of development, and I think that model is correct. But there can be more than enough people who are still at the earlier levels of development to wreak havoc in history and to create a totalitarian situation. As Jung said, walking down any city street, you would see every level of evolution from the caveman to the man of the future if you waited on one street corner long enough. So it still comes back to the individual. And basically, Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian, was very interested in the life cycle of civilizations and what could cause a civilization to decline. And basically what he discovered was when the civilization no longer had a healthy ruling mythology, it was in decline. And because of that thing about the small part recapitulates the whole, similarly in the life cycle of the individual, if you don't have a healthy ruling mythology, then your psyche is in decline. So if you look, and most people have a ruling mythology even if they don't know it. A very close relative told me once, I don't believe in God, but I do believe in the devil, and I've been cursed since the day I was born. So that's like a warped personal mythology. Another one is he who dies with the most toys wins. Another one is, sometimes you find these in bumper stickers, I owe, so off to work I go. You need something more than that. You need a deep and healthy mythology. And so this is a lot of the purpose of my book, Parallel Journeys, is it's kind of a new mythos, a new mythology, but set against a kind of dystopian sci-fi backdrop of a worldwide man-made AI extinction level event, viral plague. That's an extinction level event, but where the path of further evolution turns out not to be closed, even as things seem to have reached a complete cul-de-sac. And I should say that, add that this idea of a cul-de-sac, basically, if human consciousness remains where it was and where it is, it looks like we're coming up to an evolutionary cul-de-sac because we have lethal. We're not getting any saner. We have not brought down the human will to power, and we have not. We still have psychopaths as a perhaps even growing percentage of the population, but now we have lethal technologies, and with AI, those lethal technologies can be the hands of a single individual, and it doesn't have to be head of a nation state. This is something I point out because this is extremely related. It's a 2-hour video, but also a 15,000 word article right on the homepage called AI and the Singularity Archetype. When I wrote this book in 2013, I'm sorry, not in 20, I started working on yet another version in 2013. It took me 45 years. The idea that I needed to write such a book came right after I discovered the Singularity Archetype in 1978 when I was 20 years old. That summer, it was my philosophy honors paper. So after I graduated from college, I felt this command from the muse that like, okay, you can still keep exploring this in a more scholarly way if you want, but what you really need to do to really understand it and to communicate it to others is to write a great fantasy or sci-fi epic about it. And that goal took 45 years to achieve. In 2013, when because it was not like I was writing every day for 45 years on it, most of the time, like the portal to that world would be closed. It reopened in the fall equinox of 2013. But an event that occurred was in 2013 was going to Tucson, Arizona, and then I decided to go back and visit Biosphere 2 in Oracle, Arizona. And basically, that's a picture of it right there. Basically, from the 5-minute walk from the parking lot to the front entrance, the whole scenario of book 1 of Parallel Journeys, there are 4 books and an epilogue in the 1 volume, unfolded, and it began with an evil person using AI to create a self-mutating virus that would create an extinction level event. Well, when I finally published the book in the spring of 2023, that's when ChatGPT-4 exploded on the scene, and suddenly I realized, like, oh, I have to investigate more. Like this, I was like many people, I felt blindsided by this sudden evolutionary jump of AI. And when I started researching it, because this was always anticipated from my 1978 paper, it's actually still on the website, called Archetypes of a New Evolution. It was always understood that AI was one of those evolutionary wildcard variables, and that's why an AI plays such a key role in perhaps the best artistic expression of the singularity archetype, recognized in that paper and in a subsequent book I published in 2012, the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. So when I began researching it, I found out, reading people like Mustafa Suleiman's book, The Coming Wave. Mogad Watt was another person very high up in AI technology. These are like the founders of Google X and so forth, that they were warning about the very scenario that I foresaw with no research. It just came out of the muse or the collective unconscious of a AI being used to create a man-made viral apocalypse. They pointed out, and nobody has a rational argument against this, that someone today, and even for the last 3 or 4 years, using off-the-shelf hardware, a $20,000 desktop gene editor, and open source AI, could create novel pathogens that could create extinction level event. So this was an eerie parallelism, parallel journeys. I always had the feeling when I was writing this, it had many overlaps in my own life, that that I was writing something that was rippling out in time, and that there were ripples coming back from the future that were inspiring the book as well. So the psyche is the thing we need to worry about. To stress your patience by repeating it one more time, because I've used this quote so often. As Jung said, there is no hydrogen bomb in nature. That is all our doing. We are the great danger. Psyche is the great danger. And so now that we have these lethal technologies, because unlike with nuclear weapons, You can't put AI behind that kind of a firewall. The demographic of people, of an angry young man with a school shooter psychology who can get hold of an assault rifle is much larger than the demographic of an angry young man with the psychology of a school shooter who could get hold of a $20,000 desktop gene editor, know how to use it, and work with open source AI. But it only takes one. And so we really need to focus on psyche, and that's also best done by you focusing on your psyche, which affects the collective psyche. So, but the AI is not something that we can protect from single individuals. Like single individual doesn't have the resources to build a nuclear bomb. But as was pointed out in a documentary about Donald Trump that you can see on Amazon Prime, it begins with the words "unfit." Somebody interviewed on that documentary said, when we hire people to have anything to do with nuclear weapons, even if it's only to drive a truck that may or may not have a nuclear bomb inside of it, and those cannot be triggered by a random person coming along. We have to vet them, and are they having any marital infidelities? Are they unstable in any way? They do all this background search. To be president, we don't do any of that. They're vetted by the voters. Okay, so we are maybe about to elect someone who said in 2016, who said he knew more than the generals in 2016, and then on another occasion said, I'm really good at war, including nuclear. And four-star Marine General John Kelly and others had to explain to him when he would ask, well, why can't we use nuclear weapons? We spent so much money on them. To be fair, he did not use them, nor did he start a war. But we don't know what's coming. When we're electing a president, we better be pretty confident in that person's character, their sanity, and their stability, because the way our system is set up, that we all know about the football that travels with the president constantly, is one psyche could decide to initiate a nuclear war. So we are very dependent on psyche. Anyway, here's another Jung quote. And Jung was concerned about this thing that I was saying about the lack of a healthy ruling mythology. That the mythology that used to rule Western culture was Christianity. But even since the 1700s, people's literal belief in that mythology has been on decline. And we're now, the belief in the American dream, that was a kind of mythology, a little bit materialistic, but it was some kind of a hopeful mythology people believed in. People believed in the myth of progress. Even when I was a child, like in the early 60s, we totally believed in the myth of progress. We thought we'd be living in a Jetsons age and have our own space car and travel to Mars and, all this kind of stuff. But subsequent generations after the baby boomers have not grown up with a belief in progress through technology for the most part. They've grown up with a feeling of like a diminished horizon that, that the earth is being poisoned and that, we're running out of time. So Jung, writing in like the late 1950s, said that the collective unconscious, the world mythology was sort of like a terrifying tabula rasa. It was like a blank slate on which he expected all sorts of, that would be very vulnerable to mass psychosis, because a mass psychosis is an attempt at a religion. We have all kinds of things that are religions in the way their psychological functioning, even if they're not thought of as religions. I wrote in a paper in the 1980s about eating disorders function as a religion, where you have rituals, you have this imagined salvation of reaching the perfect weight, multi-level marketing schemes that have a charismatic leader who gets people riled up and believing in this myth of the pyramid and everything, function like religions. Being part of a raw foods movement or something, or a fruitarian, that can be like its own religion. And political movements function as religions as well, make America great again, and so forth, that run with these religious-like slogans, or the most unconscious of all of them, the motto of QAnon, where we go one, we go all. That's like the definition of a mass psychosis, or herd, right? Surrendering individual consciousness to wherever the group is going. And if we don't have any kind of healthy ruling mythology, especially a personal mythology, I have my own unique personal mythology that energizes me and gives me a very, what I call, high temperature of meaningfulness and so forth. If I didn't have that, I would be unwell. So here's Jung speaking. As I have said, the uprush of mass instincts was symptomatic of a compensatory move of the unconscious. Such a move was possible because the conscious state of the people had become estranged from the natural laws of human existence. Thanks to industrialization, large portions of the population were uprooted and were herded together in large centers. This new form of existence, with its mass psychology and social dependence on the fluctuation of markets and wages, produced an individual who is unstable, insecure, and suggestible. He was aware that his life depended on boards of directors and captains of industry, and he supposed, rightly or wrongly, that they were chiefly motivated by financial interests. He knew that, no matter how conscientiously he worked, he could still fall a victim at any moment to economic changes which were utterly beyond his control. And there was nothing else for him to rely on. Moreover, the system of moral and political education prevailing in Germany had already done its utmost to permeate everybody with the spirit of dull obedience, with the belief that every desirable thing must come from above, from those who by divine decree sat on top of the law-abiding citizen, whose feelings of personal responsibility were overruled by a rigid sense of duty. No wonder, therefore, that it was precisely Germany that fell prey to mass psychology, though she is by no means the only nation threatened by this dangerous germ. The influence of mass psychology has spread far and wide, and it's never been more contagious and able to spread quickly than in the present era, of course, because of the internet. And what is social media? With its algorithms that pull you into unproductive and dark rabbit holes and encourage you doubling down on a mass psychosis. It is the most powerful mass psychosis amplifying technology ever created. So something that I recognized, I think it was back in the 80s even, it was something that people were saying a lot on like sitcoms. I think the phrase has fallen out of favor, but sometimes it's still used. But it was one of those phrases that seemed to really capture something in the zeitgeist. It was just like a put down that you'd hear starting in these 80s sitcoms where they'd say, get a life, get a life. That's very revealing. It means that the person saying it and whoever they're saying it to doesn't actually feel like they have a real life. Get a life. You would think that that would be some kind of tautology or something. Like if you're speaking to somebody, then they clearly have a life, but that their life is just like nothing. It feels like it's just the life of what Jung called mass man. So here's Jung speaking again. The individual's feeling of weakness, indeed of non-existence, get a life, was thus compensated by the eruption of hitherto unknown desires for power. It was the revolt of the powerless, the insatiable greed of the have-nots. By such devious means, the unconscious compels man to become conscious of himself. Unfortunately, there were no values in the conscious mind of the individual which would have enabled him to understand and integrate the reaction when it reached consciousness. Nothing but materialism was preached by the highest intellectual authorities. So this is what happens. It's in another enantiodromia. You've heard me use the word before. An oscillation between extremes, coined by Heraclitus, where if you feel powerless, then you may be filled with a will to power. And then you may identify that will with a demagogue who really wants power over you, but who will say things like, I am your retribution. Really? Because he certainly sounds more like wants to be his own retribution and pursue everybody that he has a grievance against. But he tries to create this kind of identification. When they're coming after me because of various crimes and things he did, they're really coming after you. You see, so this is a demagogue trying to create this mass psychosis identification of themselves and their fate and their power with the dear leader. But then he says, but nothing but materialism was preached by the highest intellectual authorities. What is the answer that all the advertisements and social media and other forms of media give people to their feelings of wretchedness? Become wealthy, and then you can buy many things. That's what being a success means in our society, is the one who can buy many things. And this is what every product is telling you, drive a Subaru, because a Subaru equals love. Drive who you are, so that you're trying to have a feeling of identity through a car ownership and this kind of thing. After 9/11 happened, he was appropriately criticized for this. And when a president who was in touch with deeper mythological wisdom would have asked people to make some great sacrifice, or people were looking for that, what George W. Bush said, well, keep going to stores. We've got to keep the economy going. Bill Maher mocked this as shop till they drop. Okay, that's the things of consumer culture keep people like comfortably numb. But what if the economy crashes? That was what I thought would be the trigger event of mass psychosis in my 1978 paper, Archetypes of a New Evolution. Okay, here's Jung speaking again. It is a notorious fact that the morality of society as a whole is an inverse ratio to its size. The greater the aggregation of individuals, the more the individual factors are blotted out, and with them morality, which depends entirely on the moral sense of the individual and on the freedom necessary for this. Hence, every man is, in a certain sense, unconsciously a worse man when he is in society than when acting alone, for he is carried by society and to that extent relieved of his individual responsibility. Any large company composed of wholly admirable persons has the morality and intelligence of an unwieldy, stupid, and violent animal. The bigger the organization, the more unavoidable is its immorality and blind stupidity. Sanitas bestia, senatores bone viri. I probably pronounced that wrong. Jung is constantly coming up with these Latin phrases, I barely passed Latin in junior high school. Society, by automatically stressing all the collective qualities in its individual representatives, puts a premium on mediocrity, on everything that settles down to vegetate in an easy, irresponsible way. Individuality will inevitably be driven to the wall. Without freedom, there can be no morality. Our admiration for great organizations dwindles when once we become aware of the other side of the wonder, the tremendous piling up and accentuation of all that is primitive in man, and the unavoidable destruction of his individuality in the interests of the monstrosity that every great organization, in fact, is. This has also been my personal experience. That's why I'm not a big joiner of organizations and groups and clubs and so forth and congregations. I don't know that I've ever found a group that was really functioning psychologically much better than that of a high school yearbook committee. Even the C.G. Jung Society of New York that I was part of in the 80s, still had its, soap opera like, conflicts and he said, she said, and stuff like that. It's once you get a group of people together, the lowest common denominator really comes into effect. That's why I'm very much a one-on-one person. I don't even like talking to two people at the same time. I'd much rather talk to one person at a time because it's much more accurate. What I say, could be perfect for Jane, but wrong for John, but if it's one person, that's the most conscious interaction, for me at least. But again, I'm an introvert like Jung. So here's Jung speaking again. And insofar as he is normally adapted to his environment, it is true that the greatest infamy on the part of his group will not disturb him, so long as the majority of his fellows steadfastly believe in the exalted morality of their social organization. So you get people together, and they have a charismatic leader who's telling them, telling them to march on the Capitol or whatever it is. There's this feeling of like moral safety in numbers. Well, everybody else was doing it, kind of thing. And now here's Jung pointing to a very different direction. This is closer to like the answer to the position of the mutant and the mass psychosis. Small and hidden is the door that leads inward, and the entrance is barred by countless prejudices, mistaken assumptions, and fears. Always one wishes to hear of grand political and economic schemes, the very things that have landed every nation in a morass. Therefore, it sounds grotesque when anyone speaks of hidden doors, dreams, and a world within. So I'm stepping out of Jung's voice now. When Jung came to America, but I mean, he didn't even have to come here to observe this, he saw how the extroverted bias of America, focused on outer deeds, can do, being a worldly success, and so forth. But this is the opposite path of people love to talk about, when I was part of environmental groups, there'd be somebody sitting next to me at the bar drinking microbrewery beer and talking about, they do this, they're destroying the environment, they, and I'm like looking at this guy and I'm like, you just cheated on your girlfriend like an hour ago. What about that? Like what you're talking about they, but how are you, it's a form of psychological laziness. You're not looking at yourself and your own darkness at all. So people can take their anxiety and be like, these socialists, democratic, fascist, whatever, and deal with their own anxiety, their own rage, their own feeling of being a failure in life, and have a scapegoat for that. That allows them to keep that hidden inner door locked and feel much more comfortable. So, but I speak not to nations, only to the individual few, this is Jung continuing, for whom it goes without saying that cultural values do not drop down like manna from heaven, but are created by the hands of individuals. If things go wrong in the world, this is because something is wrong with the individual, because something is wrong with me. Therefore, if I am sensible, I shall put myself right first. For this I need, because outside authority no longer means anything to me, a knowledge of the innermost foundations of my being, in order that I may base myself firmly on the eternal facts of the human psyche. And now here is Jung speaking in 1937, I believe. There is indeed reason enough for man to be afraid of the impersonal forces lurking in his unconscious. We are blissfully unconscious of these forces because they never or almost never appear in our personal relations or under ordinary circumstances. But if people crowd together and form a mob, then the dynamisms of the collective man are let loose, beasts or demons that lie dormant in every person until he is part of a mob. Man in the mass sinks unconsciously to an inferior moral and intellectual level, to that level which is always there, below the threshold of consciousness, ready to break forth as soon as it is activated by the formation of a mass. The change of character brought about by the uprush of collective forces is amazing. A gentle and reasonable being can be transformed into a maniac or a savage beast. One is always inclined to lay the blame on external circumstances, but nothing could explode in us if it had not already been there. As a matter of fact, we are constantly living on the edge of a volcano, and there is, so far as we know, no way of protecting ourselves from a possible outburst that will destroy everybody within reach. It is certainly a good thing to preach reason and common sense, but what if you have a lunatic asylum for an audience or a crowd in a collective frenzy? There is not much difference between them because the madman and the mob are both moved by impersonal, overwhelming forces. And so when he's saying impersonal, there are different layers of the psyche. There's the conscious mind, then there is the personal unconscious, everything that I could remember but I'm not presently thinking about, early childhood traumas, complexes, so forth. And then there is the collective unconscious. That would be the impersonal level. So instead of saying collective unconscious, that was a translation. Jung would have preferred people say the objective unconscious, though that's confusing because of some of the associations we have with the word objective. But the idea is that it's impersonal, it's transpersonal. It's something that when you're possessed by an archetype, that archetype is not unique to you. It's part of the collective psyche, the collective unconscious. Okay, here's another Jung quote. We're going to be getting through the Jung quotes very quickly. This ghastly power is mostly explained as fear of the neighboring nation, which is supposed to be possessed by a malevolent fiend. Since nobody is capable of recognizing just where and how much he himself is possessed and unconscious, he simply projects his own condition upon his neighbor, and thus it becomes a sacred duty to have the biggest guns and the most poisonous gas. The worst of it is that he is quite right. All one's neighbors are in the grip of some uncontrollable fear, just like oneself. In lunatic asylums, it is a well-known fact that patients are far more dangerous when suffering from fear than when moved by rage or hatred. And so this is why Trump uses fear even more than rage and talks about, you won't have a country anymore and this kind of thing. Okay. Here's Jung continuing with another quote. I am thinking rather of the well-known fact that anyone who has insight into his own actions and has thus found access to the unconscious involuntarily exercises an influence on his environment. The deepening and broadening of his consciousness produce the kind of effect which the primitives call mana. It is an unintentional influence on the unconscious of others, a sort of unconscious prestige, and its effect lasts only so long as it is not disturbed by conscious intention. So what this is saying is by you working on yourself, you may enter a room and create a feeling of calm, that people need other people because we're so influenced by other members of our own species. Just by you being a silent, centered, calm presence, you can have a vast effect on a group of people that maybe prevents them from becoming a mob. So this is the effect of the charismatic personality that is charismatic because of self-actualization and individuation. Like when Jung was a young professor of psychiatry at the Bergholzli in Switzerland, they have like this amphitheater-like classroom for medical students who were studying psychiatry, and they would bring in patients with extreme conditions to kind of demonstrate what those conditions were like to the amphitheater stadium classroom setup, young apprentice doctors and so on. And they bring in this man who's supposed to be like a catatonic schizophrenic. And then Jung is just standing beside him and maybe asks him like a simple question or something. And suddenly the guy begins talking all rationally and seems to like reanimate. And Jung was mortified because he was embarrassed. It made it look like he was some kind of like cheap magician who had set this up. What had really happened, at least this is my interpretation, is that Jung was such a talismanic personality. There was so much power in his personality that it temporarily reduced the psychic entropy, that's a Jungian term, in the patient. And so, but this can also happen for better or worse. So the thing is that what is oppressing most people is what Jung called psychic entropy. And so these are like looping thought, negative thoughts. Well, I'm no good. Everything I do fails. And like people are hearing this kind of thing. And that's why people will do anything to be lifted out of that. And that's why people, even introverts, are happier when in company for the most part, because it lifts them out of that state of psychic entropy. So if you can think of that psychic entropy as scattered iron filings scattered randomly on a piece of paper. And now a charismatic personality comes along, for better or worse, because this could be a charismatic psychopath, demagogue. It's like putting a strong magnet under the piece of paper, and now the iron filings immediately become organized. They're not so entropic. They're organized by the magnetic field of the magnet. And this is what happens when people join a cult with a charismatic leader. Now their psychic entropy is lifted because they have this person telling them exactly what to do and what to think. And that's a great comfort to them because they're relieved of that chaotic inner state by a person of outside control. So this is something we really have to be careful about. But on the positive side, if you are somebody who is developing yourself and developing this kind of mana of being a centered, strong personality, but don't have manipulative, exploitive intentions, you become a positive influence. This is what people need. People need, this is one of the reasons why young males have so many problems, is that anthropologists have observed this, that what they call male protest behavior, what some might call toxic masculinity, exaggerated machismo, violence, and this kind of thing, they've observed the correlation. It's much more common in societies where mature adult males are not present, and so this is they observe this also in the inner city, where you'd have boys being raised by their grandmothers and this kind of thing. They're all the people. The fathers will be in jail and so forth, and in many cases because of unfair incarceration laws, in other cases because of their own male protest behavior, because they grew up without good examples and were violent and are in prison for that reason, or whatever. The males have taken off or were never really there, and so without a someone of your gender. Initiation is always between members of the same gender in any society. Without someone on the other side of the stream of human development, who to show you what you could become if you matured, then there's no template for that, and you have no way of escaping the feminine characteristic of the unconscious and of the women who dominate your life, like the grandmother who's raising you, or whatever. And so you develop this toxic and highly exaggerated form of masculinity. But if you are capable of developing yourself and mentoring other people, like if you're an older person like me, but you're capable of mentoring younger people, usually of your same gender, you can have a very positive effect. And that's something that I've been doing for a long time, or hoping to have a positive effect. Anyway, so let's get to this aspect. This is the aspect that we will close on. And that is, and it's also kind of the eponymous aspect, and it's in the title, The Mutant versus the Mass Psychosis. Well, this also is kind of another way of saying one of the themes of the singularity archetype, that I call in the book, the mutant versus the machine. And so this is kind of like, we're going to read some stuff about that, and that's how we will close this. But there's quite a bit of stuff to read. Anyway, patriarchal military-industrial complex versus the mutant. That's just another way of saying it. This aspect is really just a subset of the one above, but it is such a consistent mythological theme that it deserves special mention. The variations of this theme are endless, so I'll give a few examples. The Medusa Touch is a novel and also a popular movie. It starred Richard Burton, but it's from the 70s or something. It's about a man with great paranormal powers. He is deeply resentful of the existing social order and uses his abilities to destroy iconic representations of the patriarchal order, such as a space mission and a church, because he has all these paranormal abilities, and a church where British royalty and high government officials are in attendance. So the mutants could be good or they could be evil. This is the idea of like Paul Atreides in Dune, where, this is why by him becoming the Kwisatz Haderach, the one who can be many places at once, has this expanded consciousness, it affects an entire galactic power structure and will cause the fall of the Emperor. The film Akira is a classic of the greatest, as far as I know, of Japanese anime that is filled with every key aspect of the singularity archetype, including homogestalt and logos beheld, some other major aspects of the singularity archetype discussed in the book. Akira, the eponymous mutant of the story, is so powerful and mutagenic that his cells, that's all that's left of him, must be stored in an underground vault at absolute zero. If even a single one of his cells reanimates, it threatens the military-industrial complex of post-apocalyptic Neo-Tokyo. So this is a key thing I probably should have mentioned before, but it's when it comes to influencing the collective, it's not one person, one psychic vote. If a billion people who are all chanting Allah Akbar don't affect the collective unconscious very much as individuals, because lots of people are chanting that every day and have been for 1,300 years or so. But the right person having unique thoughts, any unique thought changes the whole field of information. Like if you would, computer analogies to consciousness are bogus, but if you were to give it a simple physical analog, if you were to think of the human collective unconscious as like 8 billion computers networked together, well, if a billion computers all have the same content, like a loop of Allah Akbar or whatever, lose any one of them, it doesn't change the database at all. But if just one computer has unique information, then that's catastrophic data loss if you lose that one computer, right? But also with that computer online, that data is available to all the other 8 billion computers in the network. So if you have one sufficiently high energy and unique mutant, let's take Jimi Hendrix, for example. He's been dead for 30 or 40 years, but his music has never ceased resonating for a single sentence. It's being played on loudspeakers and earbuds, across the planet. Was it because he was born to a wealthy family? Certainly not. It's because he was very high energy, had unique musical ideas, and through technological means, audio recordings and audio playback devices that allow us to hear any music we want 24/7, his influence is out of proportion to his single number and to his low status birth. So, but another variation of the military-industrial complex idea versus the mutant, like we see in Akira, is that the military-industrial complex creates mutants or attempts to harness the power of spontaneously occurring mutants. We see this in many sci-fi movies and novels, but will tend to lose control of them as they become more aware of how they are being exploited. The novel and movie The Fury and the movie Scanners are classic examples. Yet another variation is that there is a society where a military-industrial complex is in control, but is threatened by the awakening of a mutant or mutants. The ruling power will often be portrayed as a parasitic force that needs to keep the host asleep so that it can continue harvesting its energy. An excellent example of this variation is the movie The Matrix, where artificially intelligent machines have taken over the planet and keep human beings alive only to harvest their energy. An illusory matrix is created to keep humans from becoming aware of what is going on. A single awakened mutant named Neo threatens the entire power structure. So finally, I'm going to read you something I wrote called The Mutant versus the Machine in 2007. And some of it is a little bit more poetic, so hopefully it'll be a little bit of a reprieve from all this density of Jung quotes and so forth. It was actually originally written in 2004, so 20 years old. I was a young lad of just 46. And it refers to some of the work my late great friend John Major Jenkins did on 2012 and the galactic alignment, and the idea of that he was not one of those. Some people misrepresent him that said that any great thing, like Terence McKenna said, was going to happen on December 21st, 2012. If there was any validity to the Mayan time cycles, it would be a large period of time, but that would equate with that approximate period. But we may be in that turning of the ages right now. But his theories were valid even if that's not true, because he demonstrated a key archaeoastrological insight that the Maya believed in this, and how they understood it as related to an astronomical cycle, whether it lines up with outside reality or not. But this is not meant to be a serious meditation on 2012, but is more of a somewhat surreal journey entry describing a zone of heightened synchronicities and so forth. To find out what I really think of 2012, read something I wrote. It's also a YouTube called Carnival 2012, a psychological study of the 2012 phenomenon and the 22 classic pitfalls and blind spots of esoteric research. And by the way, just to clear up, something people think when you're talking about 2012, and John and I were both, strong advocates not to expect anything on that date, and trying to correct some of the nonsense being spewed by Jose Aguirres and others. The Mayan calendar did not end in 2012. Like all calendars, it's perpetual. A great cycle ended. Also, there was no Mayan prophecy. You'd hear the sound like Mayan prophecy of 2012. Absolutely zero Mayan prophecy of 2012 were ever found. There's what we know is mostly in like the Popol Vuh, it's called, about their general theories about these time cycles, but we've never found a single prophecy about 2012. Anyway, so this is me writing 20 years ago. The Equinox Party at the Circle A Ranch, a communal living situation created by young anarchists in the outskirts of Boulder, Colorado, was a magical nexus for me. One of those zones of heightened synchronicity where many threads of the great tapestry wove together into a pattern recognizable, even revelatory. With a luck that felt almost uncanny, the unpredictable lottery of high desert weather had produced a glorious winter. The first day of spring turned out to be a preview of summer, and the unexpected warmth of the evening felt almost like an enchantment, an invitation into mystery. The Circle A Ranch has an improbable location, surrounded by many acres of open fields, at the distant circumference of which were twinkling lights of suburban houses and strip malls. It seemed to be placed at the center of this open space, as if it was enclosed by an invisible dome, creating an oasis of green within a suburban landscape. There was an enormous fire pit, a crater in the ground that looked like the result of a small asteroid impact. People were drumming and dancing around a blazing fire. Next to the fire pit was a barn that was being used as the screen for surreal video projections. The barn looked like a dream cottage, intricately tie-dyed in a vat of electrical colors. Inside the main house, I set up to do free I Ching readings and dream interpretation. This was before I could do free Zap Oracle readings, from my phone. One interesting person after another showed up, providing many fascinating moments. One of a pair of identical twins told me a dream reflecting the strange dynamics unique to twin psychology. Then an 18-year-old male, we'll call him Jeremy, showed up. I knew him slightly since we were both regulars at the same coffee shop, Café Soleil, located in South Boulder. Jeremy is a philosophy student with a brilliant mind for complex ideas. We discussed a number of interesting themes, many of which I later realized were directly related to a vortex of meaning and discovery that had already begun to pull me into its centrifugal spiral. After establishing some common ground in ideas, Jeremy related a recurrent dream that had haunted his childhood. In the dream, he would always find himself at the bottom of a red pit as a gigantic steamroller, a leviathan as he described it, would be rolling toward him. The dream, which could be, so it's kind of an iconic image of the mutant versus the machine. He's at the bottom of a red pit and a giant leviathan-sized steamroller is coming toward him. The dream, which could be contained in a single sentence, had a deceptive simplicity. The simplicity concealed a great density of meaning, which would continue to expand in my mind during the next 24 hours. At first, however, I saw the dream as archetypal and straightforward. A recurrent childhood dream will often, in my experience, map out the core situation of the dreamer's incarnation. The dream dramatically portrayed the self versus the collective. The self finds itself in a fallen world, a pit, and the collective, far more massive than the individual, is antagonistic to individual consciousness. It especially seeks to flatten what I call mutants. A mutant, as I use the term, is a mutagenic individual who lives outside of approved collective parameters and is in a state of heightened metamorphosis. You are more likely to find them among the young because the pressures of the collective steamroller have yet to press with enough force and time to flatten the young into the flattened outline of a person we call a normal adult. I might shade that a bit more now. The I Ching said that conditioning, the flattening process, if you will, peaked in individuals at 16, and in my experience, few people ever survive high school. But those that do may be more likely to still be alive than when you find them later in midlife, because there's kind of a winnowing process where that commitment to individuality is constantly being pressed down by economic forces and the need to take care of children and things like that. Jeremy was clearly a mutant. His eyes had that iridescent afterglow, and it's also this effect that old souls have where time seems to slow down around them because there's kind of like a depth of perception going on in the inner camera. He emanated a large field of self-awareness and compassion, and there was about him the blue and indigo feeling of higher thinking and an older spiritual nature. Boulder was the highest per capita occurrence of mutants of any place I've ever encountered, and the Equinox Party was a mutant nexus within Boulder. But even in such a mutant-intensive environment, Jeremy stood out as unusual. I thought I had perfectly comprehended the dream as the most familiar of themes, the mutant versus the machine. The steamroller, as I pointed out to Jeremy, is a machine whose exclusive purpose is dimension reduction. The job of the steamroller is to take that which is three-dimensional and make it essentially two-dimensional, flatten it. And this is what the massive inertia of the collective baseline of consciousness seeks to do to the mutant, to flatten them into dimensional conformity, to make them part of the asphalt of flatland, a smooth surface that the big machinery can roll over with as little friction as possible. What an appropriate dream to encounter at a party put on by young anarchists. I had a similar insight after 14 years of being a public school teacher, where I realized in a single sentence that the unconscious purpose of much compulsory education was to be so sadistic and unpleasant so as to bring down the normal desire to learn that's intrinsic in human beings sufficiently so society can make use of you. Sadistic maybe was still characteristic of some schools, and certainly like, older English boarding schools and stuff like that. I would probably substitute the word dull as perhaps more appropriate for modern schools than sadistic. I compared Jeremy's position in the dream to the young man standing in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square. I pointed out a favorite saying in present-day totalitarian China: "The nail which stands out gets pounded down." I concluded by pointing out to Jeremy that it would be a mistake to perceive himself as a victim in this situation. What was needed was self-compassionate, courageous acceptance of his incarnation into this fallen world. I suggested he consider this something he signed on to develop his awareness. Boot camp for the soul. That what I take for myself, but I don't necessarily oblige others to feel this way, is that like, okay, I chose to incarnate in a interesting period, a difficult period of history, but with greater resources available to the individual than any other that has come before. Feeling I had satisfactorily interpreted this dream, I let Jeremy get back to the party while I got to the next patiently waiting person to work on their dreams. One person after another showed up for dream interpretation or I Ching. Inevitably, I hit walls of exhaustion with this. As an introvert, I can only take so much of the intensity of contact with another's psyche in these consultations before I become burned out and have to get up and walk around to regain my equilibrium. There were also opportunities to experience the equinox party, which impressed me with its positive vibe and mutant intensiveness. I've been to many Boulder parties, and even the better ones seem to attract a sizable number of those hungry ghost types you could often see lurking around Penny Lane, a now dissolved Boulder coffee shop. They are the sort that always have dark circles under their eyes and the sulky feeling of a vampire indulging self-pity because it hasn't fed in a while. At the equinox party, there were much less of that type than usual, and more of the brighter, happening type of people. Everyone was so friendly and approachable, and even after 9 years of living in Boulder, that still amazes me, having grown up in New York City. Even as dawn drew near, the energy was still vibrant. Around 5 a.m., I noticed that a collection of the most perpetual of Boulder's hungry ghosts, aging Trustafarians, and so forth, had appeared and seemed to linger at the edges of the party, absorbing energy. This brought on sudden flashes of memory of the 80s club scene in New York City when I was living in the East Village. It's written about in the epilogue of Parallel Journeys, and the intense, surreal vampires I encountered there. The vampires from that scene would eat these languid Boulder vampires for breakfast. The arrival of these Trustafarian bloodsuckers was my departure signal, and I retreated to my 18-foot RV home, parked in a grassy field outside the Circle A Ranch. The next day I found that of all the dreams and interesting encounters of the equinox, it was Jeremy's dream that kept replaying in my mind. I labeled the dream "The Mutant versus the Machine." So that's where the name of that motif of the singularity archetype came from. Later that afternoon, I found myself inside a different kind of machine, an ancient brown bomber from the 70s, from the 70s era Saab, hurtling down I-25. The Saab had a missing gas cap, and gas fumes blasted in with what passes for air on I-25. I was sitting in the back seat, feeling that the Saab might be a literal bomb, and that my life might end in a fireball of gasoline and Swedish car parts. Jeremy's Mutant versus the Machine dream amplified itself in my mind. I imagined I was in the red pit. The redness seemed like the redness of the red planet, Mars, but the air smelled industrial, an atmosphere of gasoline and burnt rubber. The pit was a giant crater, perhaps ground zero of a nuclear detonation in the desert. Near the center of the pit was a young mutant boy, pale, perhaps naked. He couldn't be seen clearly because there was a distorted visual field around him, shimmering energy like heat ripples above hot asphalt. I could feel him staring with horror at the mechanical leviathan rolling up to the crater's edge. It was all steel and tractor yellow, part steamroller, part bulldozer, and part tank, but titanic in size, able to eclipse the desert sun. The mutant's energy intensified with horror and fear of this great machine that sought his flatness. A silent scream was forming in him, ready to burst, and the psionic energy shimmering around him suddenly intensified like the flickering of a candle flame, becoming the metal vaporizing jet of an acetylene torch. The form of the mutant boy, large-eyed and pale, appeared blurred and prismatic within the fiercely rippling corona of energy. A scream then erupted. It was not an acoustical scream. It was a scream of will and mutant psionic energy, a scream to shatter dimensions. In a moment, the mechanical titan was pulverized into smoky dust that vaporized before it even hit the ground. Fissures suddenly began forming in the red ground. Giant crevasses cracked open, tectonic plates shook in massive collision, and the red planet felt as though it were about to explode into dust. The dream seemed to surround me like a red pit and wouldn't let me out. It came at me insistently like the gasoline vapors and blasts of I-25 air. Seeking to divert my attention, I pulled out my handheld wireless computer gadget and began looking for something to read. This was pre-smartphone. It might have been like a Sharp Wizard or something like that. Some months before, my friend John Major Jenkins, who authored books about the Maya, sent me a link to something Jay Widener and Sharon Rose had written entitled Tolkien and the End of Time. For reasons of brevity, I will refer to Widener and Rose collectively as Jay. Strange choice, but that's what I wrote. John knew I was working on a new Tolkien study, Casting Precious into the Cracks of Doom, Androgyny, Alchemy, Evolution, and the One Ring. Available on the website as a document and as a YouTube. Jay, one of my most important works. Jay writes about alchemy, and a few days ago I corresponded with him briefly about a fascinating piece he wrote about Stanley Kubrick's 2001, a film I had studied and written about in the late 70s. I knew that whatever Jay had written was probably full of insights, and even though this was so directly related to what I was writing, I had procrastinated on reading it for months. Now that my life seemed ready to end in an explosion of petroleum vapors, I decided it was time to stop putting it off. I began to read on the tiny computer screen in the back of the Saab, and instantly I found stunning relevance to the dream that was haunting me, and the active imagination, insistent vision, too. Jay superimposed the end of an age story, the Tolkien's Ring Trilogy, obviously, exactly what the Ring Trilogy represents, onto the perennial philosophy and cycle of 4 ages described by many ancient mystery traditions, like the Egyptians, the Western alchemists, the Hindus, the Hopi Indians, and so forth, the Maya. John Jenkins had written about this cycle of ages in his book Galactic Alignment, and we had talked about it some time ago, but the details had blurred in my mind. According to the Maya, the Western alchemists, and the ancient Hindus, there are 4 great cycles or ages, each lasting about 6,000 years. In the first age, there is the greatest connection to spiritual light, but that light diminishes by 1/4 until we get to the 4th age, our present age, at least in 2004, the period we today refer to as history, or that the Hindus would call. The Hindus referred to these ages as yugas, and our present age of darkness is called the Kali Yuga. Each age is symbolically associated with a metal. The Satya Yuga is the Golden Age, the Treta Yuga is the Silver Age, the Dvapara Yuga is the Bronze Age, and the Kali Yuga is the Iron Age. As Jay writes, according to ancient lore, the Iron Age is an age where the world turns to steel. Black magic becomes religion, and men lust for control and dominion over both human beings and the very earth itself. The galactic alignment that the Maya correctly identified with the approximate zone around 2012, the December solstice sun dark rift, is not the signal of the end of the world, but might be connected to the end of the Iron Age. It represents the end of the cycle of 4 ages, but it may also mark the beginning of a new golden age, at least according to perennial philosophy. New connections, an emergent pattern in the great tapestry began to coalesce in my mind. The red pit, the red planet. Mars is red for the same reason blood is red, iron. A red pit is a pit of iron oxide, and what threatens to flatten the mutant in this iron pit? A titanic machine of iron and steel, steel merely being the modern iron alloy. This recurrent dream showed Jeremy's incarnational position and that of all mutants living in this time, facing down the machine in the red pit of the Iron Age, like the young man facing down the tank in Tiananmen Square in China. This dream brought to me in a party of young anarchists was a harbinger of the end of the Iron Age. And I actually wrote the young man facing down the tank in red China. Which is appropriate, but it furthers the red motif. A song then came over the Sobs radio, an old U2 song from back in the day when that brown bomber of a car was still a gleam in the eye of a Swedish engineer. All is quiet on New Year's Day. Under a blood-red sky, we can break free. We can be one. I will begin again. The time is right. This is the golden age. I think this is from the song New Year's Day by U2. The fragments of U2 I caught through the blasts of I-25 air were stunning synchronicities. I wondered if maybe the Saab had already combusted into a fireball, my body consumed in a Swedish automotive inferno, and lost in some bardo, I was getting messages of a new cycle of a time occurring under a blood-red sun and the approach of a golden age over a car radio that existed only in my dismembered imagination. If this was true, there wasn't much I could do about it, so I kept reading. As I continued to read, I found Jay discussing Tolkien's hatred of the machine age. This I already knew. Once an interviewer made the mistake of asking Tolkien, "So, Mr. Tolkien, what makes you tick?" Tolkien responded dryly, "I don't tick because I'm not a machine." In letters written during World War II to his son Christopher, an RAF pilot, he despaired of the need to use Mordor gadgets to defeat Mordor, and the hopelessness of using Sauron's magic to defeat Sauron. Those are actual Tolkien quotes. Whatever side won the war on the machines, as Tolkien put it, the real winner, he wrote, would be the machine. Throughout his life, repeated again and again in his letters, Tolkien described our world as a fallen world. He recognized that this is a time when the more spiritual magic of the elves had given way to the dense material magic of technology. Tolkien and his son Michael had recurrent dreams of Atlantis. This is Tolkien's words now, of all the mythical or archetypal images, this is the one most deeply seated in my imagination, and for many years I had a recurrent Atlantis dream, the stupendous and ineluctable wave advancing from the sea or over the land, sometimes dark, sometimes green and sunlit. Graham Hancock would probably have a field day with that vision because it corresponds to his theory of some great flood wiping out civilizations around 12,000 years ago. In Tolkien's mythology, as described from the Silmarillion, the golden age of Atlantis is related to the second age, which involves the rise and fall of Numenor. As we pass through Tolkien's ages, there is a darkening, densification, and externalization of inner spiritual magic. Jay quotes Tolkien. All use of external plans or devices, apparatus, instead of developments of these inherent inner powers or talents, or even the use of these talents with the corrupted motive of dominating, bulldozing the real world or coercing other wills. Bulldozing the real world? This seemed another staggering synchronicity, the bulldozer being the symbolic synonym of the steamroller in the dream. So it's just this intense vortex of synchronicities during one car ride. As Jay points out, the symbolic metals of the four ages, gold, silver, bronze, and iron, gain in atomic density as they move from gold to iron. The Iron Age is one of dense materialism and lost contact with the spiritual realm, an age when someone will work long, monotonous hours at a job, perhaps to make payments on a giant SUV. But here, at the end of the Iron Age, some densification trends are giving way to the spirit, effusing even the black magic of the machine. Synchronistically, this subject came up in the talk with Jeremy, which preceded the dream. I pointed out to him that in the last 20 years or so, as the value of America's industrial output has tripled, its physical weight has halved as we make less iron and more pixels, vanishingly small computer chips, and intellectual property in the form of zeros and ones. Even our machines are becoming etherealized. And as I pointed out in discussions with John Major Jenkins, as we align with the galactic center, we are also, in a symbolic sense at least, aligning with the black hole at its center, a place where matter is irrealized, space and time disappear, and a possible portal into another dimension opens up. Perhaps this zone of alignment is a window of opportunity to dissolve our identifications, perhaps even to irrealize our bondage to matter. Jay also pointed out a connection Tolkien makes obvious in his letters. The one ring and the machine define the same densification and externalizing of magic. The one ring, made of the most impervious of metals, gets heavier as Frodo brings it closer to Mount Doom. As I've written in Casting Precious into the Cracks of Doom, Androgyny, Alchemy, Evolution, and the One Ring, Mount Doom has a connection to the black hole. It is a place aligned with the end of an age, a place to cast down the black magic, a place where it can be irrealized, returned to the alchemist's prima materia from which it was formed. Stephen Dedalus, the James Joyce character, has said, "History is the nightmare from which I am trying to awaken. The galactic alignment, which we are in right now," it's a big cycle of time if we believe the perennial philosophy and the Mayan time prophecy, is the chance for us collectively, but especially for us as individual mutants, to awaken from the long, long nightmare of history.